Well, we're here. Can you hear me? Is this working? Okay. Well, I guess all I can say is welcome to a somewhat delayed Mass Media Week. Obviously, we missed our first deadline. But I can assure you it really wasn't our fault. Considering that the airplane landed at something like 7:25, I think we're pretty fortunate to be here at all. Well, tonight we're exceedingly fortunate to have as our lead-off speaker Mr. Barry Sussman, and I thought that before what happened this afternoon. He, as you well know, is the Washington Post editor who coordinated the Watergate investigation for which the Washington Post was awarded this year's Pulitzer Prize Gold Medal. From the day of the break-in arrests at Democratic headquarters in June of 1972, Mr. Sussman directed the Post's coverage of the affair, and then as the story grew in proportion, he was detached from his other duties as editor in charge of the District of Columbia News to work exclusively on Watergate coverage. Mr. Sussman was born in New York City, was graduated from Brooklyn College, and prior to joining the Washington Post in 1965, was managing editor of a small southern daily. In addition to bringing a Pulitzer Prize to the Post, Mr. Sussman and his two-man Watergate investigating team were given the $6,000 Drew Pearson Foundation Award for investigative reporting, and Sussman himself won a Newspaper Guild Front Page Award that included naming him Editor of the Year. One of the very first speeches suggesting the magnitude of the Watergate scandal was made by Sussman before an audience of more than 400 Washington journalists and House and Senate members last December. Mr. Sussman is now working on a book on Watergate that is scheduled for publication later this fall. It is indeed my pleasure to introduce to you Mr. Barry Sussman, district editor of one of this nation's truly distinguished newspapers, the Washington Post. Mr. Sussman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Schwartz. If I'm a little tongue-tied, it's from being over Chicago for 2.5 hours this afternoon. I'm not sure anything I say will make any sense at all, and I want to appreciate the opportunity I have in being here and say thank you to everybody who brought me here. I've been asked to speak some about the Washington Press Corps and about the role of the media as a watchdog in government, in line with the theme of your discussions here this week. Now, oddly, I don't know very much about the Washington Press Corps. My job has been to cover local news, and it's almost like somebody here in Des Moines talking about the Washington Press Corps. I will offer some judgments. The Washington Press Corps as a group is like any other group. It has some good reporters, some fine reporters, and some excellent reporters. And if you want, you can go down the other way. These reporters must buck a government propaganda machine whose size isn't even known, but is believed to be from 2 times to 5 times as large as that of the press corps itself. If reporters were forced to follow the pronouncements of government flacks, they would never have time to do their own reporting. Yet, if reporters don't pay attention to the pronouncements of the various government agencies, they'd be guilty of a kind of censorship. The government, after all, is entitled to get its message across to the people. So except for a few very large newspapers, reporters have a problem in going through a day without succumbing to numerous press conferences where little other than the official position is presented, and wading through numerous press releases. That is one problem that faces the Washington Press Corps. Another problem is the PAC syndrome. The Washington Press Corps talks to itself, reads what its members write, gathers in the same meeting places, and is forced, when one member has a strong story, to follow up on that story. If one reporter, for example, I believe it was Clark Mullenhoff, who you people are familiar with, were to break a story on the case of Ernest Fitzgerald, the Air Force cost accountant who lost his job for recommending economies, then the other reporters must also write about Ernest Fitzgerald. Fitzgerald becomes fashionable for a while. That's fine in the case of Fitzgerald. But one finds that other more lasting subjects are sometimes treated as fads when they shouldn't be. For example, civil rights, which seems to become important every now and then, but not consistently important. Housing fits this category. So does the environment. The problem is not one of reporting. The reporting is usually fine, but the press corps must spread itself too thin. If anything, the problem of the press corps being spread too thin is more accentuated these days because of Watergate. This is not a call for putting Watergate aside, but it might be a call to have more reporters in Washington. Any other alleged problems of the Washington press corps, such as biases for or against individuals, or biases in favor of certain philosophies, seem to me to be matters of individual eccentricity, not a group problem. We hear much about bias from the government. I, for one, don't see that much of it. Now, as for the watchdog function of newspapers, every decent newspaper that I have ever seen has caught government officials with their hands in the till, from traffic ticket fixing to the awarding of multi-million-dollar contracts. If there's one thing understood about a good newspaper, it is that it does not shrink from exposing the excesses of government on the local, state, and federal levels. Newspapers all over the country have always done this. It would be ridiculous to think that investigative reporting began with Watergate. The Watergate example was so striking, however, that people far and wide have suddenly come to regard all newspapers as their watchdog. The mail at the Post has become unbelievable. I have received letters and telephone calls from across the country, from California, the Dakotas, Mississippi, Florida, Tennessee, and elsewhere, asking that the Post look into specific murders, into the energy scandal, and into any number of stories that most everybody says are really much bigger than Watergate. Some of these stories would have been regarded as totally outlandish only a few months ago, but nowadays nothing's outlandish. I'm sure that Watergate reporting has made people look to newspapers, and to a degree, television, as a force of justice that nobody thought of them as since the turn of the century, when the term muckraking really became popular. There is an interesting process that takes place in investigative reporting. I've seen scandals of a local nature come and go, just the way Watergate looked for a while, as though it were going to disappear. When a newspaper prints a well-documented report exposing corruption or a particular community or national problem, that is only the first step in coping with that problem. Often the second step is never taken. We hear much about an aroused citizenry, but speaking from my own experience, there is little that an aroused citizenry can do when government corruption is exposed. An aroused citizenry is marvelous when it comes to finding a house for a family whose home has been gutted by fire, or for chipping in and sending the local band to Europe. But an aroused citizenry can do little more than worry or complain when there is scandal involving a local hospital, a government contract, or a Watergate. The people who must respond in those situations are very limited in number. They are the government officials themselves, the political parties, and occasionally various pressure groups. When a newspaper story is picked up by one of these groups, there may be results. But often the story is not picked up. And what seems like a burning issue to a newspaper editor is soon forgotten. A newspaper that keeps pushing an issue by itself, say, for example, a newspaper that runs daily editorials or weekly editorials on gun control, begins to take on the appearance of a crusader and almost invariably loses some of its credibility among many readers. So while newspapers often fulfill a watchdog function, it is also often very frustrating work. The newspapers point to the rascals, but the rascals don't like to throw themselves out. All of this brings me to the subject I want to get into tonight, Watergate and what I see as the battle of the moment. Will Watergate be shunted to the courts and out of the more public arenas that it is now in? If so, who decides this and on what grounds? In Washington just this month, as Congress resumed, Senator Dole said that the people were tired of Watergate. Then Vice President Agnew said that politicians were being persecuted, that, quote, the motives of those of us involved in politics at all levels are being called into question, that many assume that we are simply out for ourselves, with no thought of the public interest. Practices and procedures that were acceptable 2 months ago are being condemned today simply for being political. Political appointments are condemned as patronage, when in fact they provide the only way of getting control of an entrenched and reluctant bureaucracy that is unwilling to adjust to the will of the people. End quote. Some recent examples of patronage to adjust to the will of the people that I can think of were these. The naming of Eagle Krogh as Undersecretary of Transportation at an annual salary of $42,500 in January 1973. Krogh has since been indicted in the break-in in the office of Daniel Ellsberg's psychiatrist. The naming of Jeb Magruder as Director of the Commerce Department's Office of Policy Development after having been Executive Director of the 1972 Inaugural Committee. Magruder has since pleaded guilty in the Watergate conspiracy. The naming of Gordon Strachan as General Counsel to the United States Information Agency in December 1972. Strachan said that he destroyed files dealing with political spying at the request of H.R. Haldeman. Are these the kind of appointments that the Vice President says are being condemned as political? Mr. Agnew said that politicians at all levels were being persecuted because of Watergate. Some people thought that Watergate was about a few politicians, those who were involved in the re-election effort. Now, the President says we shouldn't wallow in Watergate, and as Congress returned, the leaders of both parties said we should turn to more important affairs. Senator Mansfield, the Democratic Senate Majority Leader, who was largely responsible for creation of the Senate Watergate Committee, said he wanted the committee to complete its hearings by October 15th or November 1st at the latest. Senator Baker said that Watergate has, quote, undoubtedly interfered with his other work, but he, like me, has scheduled an extensive lecture tour on Watergate. I don't have other work to do. Others said that the people wanted to cope with inflation, as though we can't be concerned about rising prices and honesty in government at the same time. I'll talk for just a moment about inflation. Did you know that the Nixon Re-Election Committee said in court that it was paying Gordon Liddy $250,000 to find out how large some anti-administration demonstrations were going to be in 1972, and for some other legal intelligence gathering on the side? I know a newspaper reporter who finds out how large demonstrations are going to be and doesn't get paid a dime in overtime for it. $250,000, that's inflation. I know one reason I was invited here was to talk a bit about what the Washington Post did last summer on Watergate. And before I get into that, I would like to say that any views that I present are my own views and not the views of the newspaper, I'm here on my own time, vacation time, and this trip was not scheduled through the paper. I'd like to make that part clear so nobody blames the Washington Post for what I might say. I became obsessed with the Watergate early. My job at the Post was editor in charge of City News with a staff of about 35 reporters and half a dozen editors. I was called at home early in the morning on June 17, 1972, told there had been a break-in, and I went to work assigning reporters to various aspects of that little mystery. By the end of a week, I was fascinated with the possibilities of Watergate. We knew before a week was out that James McCord worked for the Re-Election Committee, that a White House consultant named Howard Hunt was connected to the arrested men in some way, that two of the men, Eugenio Martinez and Frank Sturgis, had been doing such mundane work as trying to find sleeping accommodations for 3,000 young Republicans at the convention in Miami. We knew that another arrested man, Bernard Barker, had been trying to get architects' plans for the Miami Convention Center at a time when only the Democrats were scheduled to hold their convention in Miami. With such apparent strong ties to the re-election drive, it seemed clear that these men were working on behalf of the Nixon Committee and not, as the White House was saying at the time, working in part of some right-wing Cuban conspiracy. But newspapers are like the rest of society, a little slow to react. For about a month, the Post had one reporter, Bob Woodward, doing what you would call investigative work on Watergate. Lawrence O'Brien, the Democratic Party chairman, kept insisting that Watergate was a major campaign issue, but few people were listening. Sometimes the press didn't even assign a reporter to cover O'Brien's press conferences. Then around July 20th, as the story seemed to be drifting, our managing editor, Howard Simons, asked me to see that it didn't drift. He felt the story had too much potential. I assigned the two reporters to work on it full-time, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein. Woodward had been with the Post less than 10 months, Bernstein about 6 years. Neither one knew much about relationships or true power in the White House. As we started out on Watergate, we gave no thought to where it would take us. We were never out to get anyone or any group. We had a small set of facts, the facts I just listed, pieces in a puzzle, and we were looking for the other pieces to fill out the puzzle. On July 31st, about 10 days after this team was formed, we stumbled on a very significant story. Bernstein discovered that a $25,000 check from a man named Kenneth Dahlberg had gone in and out of the bank account of Bernard Barker's real estate firm in Miami, along with 4 other checks from Mexico for $89,000. The existence of the Mexican checks was previously known. They were supposed to have represented payment and return of money on a real estate transaction that fell through. Woodward called Dahlberg in Minneapolis to find out what the story was on his check. Dahlberg said he was a fundraiser for Nixon and that the $25,000 had been a campaign contribution, money raised in Florida that he personally handed to either Maurice Stans, the chief Nixon fundraiser, or to the committee treasurer, a man named Hugh Sloan. The story was a breakthrough. It showed conclusively that the Watergate burglars had some sort of tie to ranking Nixon campaign officials. After it appeared on August 1st, Congressman Henry Royce of the House Banking and Currency Committee asked the chairman of that committee, Wright Patman, to conduct an investigation. Over the next 2.5 months, until the middle of October, the Patman Committee made some interesting findings. But Patman was beaten back when he attempted to get subpoena power and hold televised hearings in advance of the election. On October 4th, 1972, the Patman Committee voted 20 to 15 against giving itself subpoena power, with 6 Democrats joining the 14 Republicans to block Patman. Those who explained their vote said they wanted to protect the civil liberties of the 7 men who had been indicted for the Watergate bugging and break-in. They said they didn't want politics to interfere with justice. When it became clear that the Patman Committee wouldn't hold hearings, Senator Kennedy began his own investigation quietly. He did subpoena bank records, telephone records, and sent investigators to California and elsewhere. Over the winter, the Kennedy investigators uncovered the information that eventually led to the formation of the Ervin Committee. That story on August 1st was also seen by a man named Philip Hughes, the director of the Office of Federal Elections, which had been set up to oversee enforcement of new campaign disclosure laws that were passed in 1971. Hughes began his own investigation, and within 3 weeks, he discovered a previously unreported cash fund of $350,000, much of it kept in the safe of Maurice Stans. When this discovery was made, Woodward and Bernstein began to climb the money tree. They found that high aides to John Mitchell had access to this money, and that it was apparently used for other political spying and sabotage. By October, they were able to report that Mitchell himself controlled this fund while he was still Attorney General. And in October, the Post reported that FBI agents had concluded that the Watergate bugging was simply one maneuver in a massive campaign of political spying and sabotage conceived by high White House aides as basic re-election strategy. These stories had little or no effect on the electorate in November. The White House had begun a campaign in October to convince people that Watergate was a concoction of the press, to make the alleged collaboration between the press and George McGovern the issue in the election, and sidestep the question of White House culpability for Watergate. A combination of that maneuver and the apparent dislike of so many Americans for McGovern was more than enough to bury Watergate for the time being under a Nixon election landslide. Essentially, that describes the role of the Washington Post in Watergate. Between August and the election, we had more than 70 stories, about half of them by Woodward and Bernstein. Their coverage continued in 1973. When the public began to hear of some incredible goings-on, it was often these reporters who told them first. But the situation was different. In 1972, the forces of government were hiding the facts. In 1973, most of the time, there has been no way to keep them hidden. As more and more became known, the President and some leaders of both parties began telling us to leave Watergate to the courts, where it would be dealt with as a legal problem, and for the Senate and the rest of us to get on with the nation's business. Watergate, they said, was the act of a few overzealous men. Watergate, in effect, was just politics. We are being told that the public believes this, and there is indeed some supporting evidence. Opinion polls show that while 3/4 of the people believe that the President either knew of Watergate in advance or was involved personally in the cover-up, only 1/4 to 1/5 of the people want the Congress to act against him. In other words, the public does seem to believe in large numbers that Watergate is just politics. One of the crimes revealed by Watergate, perhaps the fundamental Watergate crime, was a massive assault on the minds of the public. People were told through rigged polls, telegram campaigns, and fraudulent advertising, all paid for by the Nixon campaign and not listed as campaign expenses in violation of law, that Americans approved the President's conduct of the war in Vietnam. After the mining of Haiphong in 1972, re-election headquarters, a block from the White House, was filled with people cutting out hundreds of coupons from newspapers and sending them in, along with postcards, to a local Washington TV station that was sampling opinion on the subject. Perhaps half the responses to this poll came from the re-election committee, totally distorting the results. At the White House, it was announced that mail and telegrams were running 5 or 6 to 1 in favor of the mining. But of course, nothing was said about the campaign to get those letters and telegrams sent in. There may be something of a campaign on now to tell us that Watergate is just politics. How serious was Watergate? What was Watergate? There was Watergate, there was the Watergate cover-up, the cover-up of the cover-up, and what's going on now, attempts to confine Watergate to the courts, buying time, as it were. The Watergate itself was the spying by one political force against another, for which 7 men were indicted in the summer of 1972, convicted and imprisoned in 1973. It was the exposure of illegality in the amassing of approximately $22 million in secret election campaign funds, part of that through bribery and extortion, what several oil firms, airlines, and other companies thought was the price of doing business in the United States. It was the throwing into confusion the campaigns of opponents by wiretapping, writing of Canuck letters, having the Secret Service report to agents of the President on the activities of George McGovern. Some of it may have been brilliantly inspired, like the sending of 200 pizzas and 2 magicians from the Virgin Islands to a Muskie dinner in Washington. But we don't know for sure who did that. Some of it, investigators have said, was possibly legal, but nevertheless clandestine and insidious. The Watergate cover-up was the obstruction of justice with instructions emanating from the White House for the forced cooperation of the Department of Justice, the FBI, and the Central Intelligence Agency. Let me be more specific here. On May 22, 1973, President Nixon, in his most complete statement on Watergate, said that his immediate reaction after the bugging arrests, quote, was that those guilty should be brought to justice, and with the 5 burglars themselves already in custody, I assumed that they would be. Within a few days, however, I was advised there was a possibility of CIA involvement in some way. It did seem to me possible that because of the involvement of former CIA personnel and because of some of their apparent associations, the investigation could lead to the uncovering of covert CIA operations totally unrelated to the Watergate break-in. In addition, by this time, the name of Mr. Hunt had surfaced in connection with Watergate, and I was alerted to the fact that he had previously been a member of the Special Investigations Unit in the White House. Therefore, I was also concerned that the Watergate investigation might well lead to an inquiry of the activities of the Special Investigations Unit itself. The Special Investigations Unit, of course, is the White House plumbers. In this area, I felt it was important to avoid disclosure of the details of the national security matters with which the group was concerned. I knew that once the existence of the group became known, it would lead inexorably to a discussion of these matters, some of which remain today highly sensitive. I'm continuing to quote for just a moment. I instructed Mr. Haldeman and Mr. Ehrlichman to ensure that the investigation of the break-in not expose either an unrelated covert operation of the CIA or the activities of the White House Investigations Unit, and to see that this was personally coordinated between General Walters, the Deputy Director of the CIA, and Mr. Gray of the FBI, end quote. The result of this order by the President was a meeting June 23, 1972, 6 days after the Watergate arrests, between Haldeman, Ehrlichman, Vernon Walters, and Richard Helms of the CIA. All 4 have testified under oath about this meeting. The CIA officials said they knew there was no CIA involvement in Watergate and that an investigation would not jeopardize CIA operations. Nevertheless, Walters was ordered to tell Patrick Gray that an investigation in Mexico would threaten CIA operations, and he did so. Gray, who had checked with Helms only the day before and was told that the CIA was not involved, was not especially surprised at what Walters told him, In government agencies, as in enterprises everywhere, it's not uncommon for one hand not to know what the other hand is doing. So the effect of the President's order was to short-circuit the investigation into the Mexican checks, and, as has been testified by Gray and by others, the Dahlberg check as well. These, at the time, were the only ties between ranking campaign officials and the Watergate burglars. Had Patrick Gray not continued to be aggressive, that order had the potential to bury any serious Watergate investigation at the very beginning. But to the credit of the FBI and Patrick Gray, who has suffered for the mistakes he did make, it is clear that Gray ran an active, no-holds-barred investigation until the Justice Department prevented him from doing so. The President's order to maintain the secrecy of the Special Investigations Unit was not completed simply by curtailing the investigation. A way had to be found to assure that the plumbers themselves would not talk, especially Howard Hunt. A way was found. It was for the White House to pay Hunt to keep silent and apparently to offer him executive clemency. Now, what were the activities of the plumbers that the President described as national security matters? We don't know all of them yet, but the ones we do know of don't sound like national security. We know that in the midst of the ITT affair in 1972, when a lobbyist wrote a memo making reference to ITT support for the Republican convention in August, that lobbyist, Dita Beard, was taken to a hospital in Denver. We know that the person who took her there was Gordon Liddy, a secret agent for the White House. We know that another secret agent, a plumber, Howard Hunt, traveling to Denver under an assumed name and wearing a red wig, visited her there to discuss her memo. Why was the White House involved in this, and why or how was this determined to be national security? On Senator Edward Kennedy, and that when he returned to the White House, Hunt worked at compiling a dossier on Senator Kennedy. We know that Hunt had top secret clearance to go over 240 State Department cables and manufacture his own cables from them, rewriting history to make President Kennedy appear complicitous in the 1963 assassination of Ngo Dinh Diem in South Vietnam. And of course, we know the role of Hunt and Liddy in the break-in at the Los Angeles office of Dr. Lewis Fielding, Daniel Ellsberg's psychiatrist. It will take some doing to prove to a jury that that and any of the plumber's work that is now known was legitimate national security. Now, I realize I'm telling you things that you're aware of, but I think that when we are asked to make a judgment that Watergate should be taken out of the political arena, that it should be confined to the courts, we should look at the totality of the Watergate offense. The cover-up was revealed in March, April, and May 1973. At that point, we have been told, the President acted immediately to deal with the Watergate cover-up conspirators around him, although many people have questioned whether or not he did. I would rather not go into detail on this aspect, which many people consider the cover-up of the cover-up, although I will be glad to answer questions about it. As spring turned into summer in 1973, The public was told of new Watergate-related White House horror stories, as John Mitchell would call them. It learned of the Houston Plan, approved by the President in 1970, that sanctioned illegal surreptitious entry, surveillance of personal mail, and increased domestic wiretapping. It learned of enemies lists, the intended use of the Internal Revenue Service to aid friends of the White House and harm its alleged enemies. Recently, it was even told that the Secret Service had wiretapped the President's brother. Somebody will get rich writing a glossary on Watergate from Walsh to Ziegler. Maybe all of this was just politics. But to me, that seems irrelevant. For to say that Watergate was just politics, that there was a taping capacity in the White House when the President came there, and things of that kind, is not really to excuse it. It is only to condemn what had gone on before. If there's a compelling reason not to turn away from Watergate, it's the need to set things straight, to get to the bottom of the mess in the open, to see that politics, Watergate style, doesn't repeat itself. But some congressmen are returning to Washington, leaders, and saying that the people are tired of Watergate and want to turn to more important subjects. Now, how do they know that the people feel that way? It is when one gets to what the parties are saying and doing these days that the mind-boggling subject of Watergate becomes too much for almost everyone. Here in brief are what leaders of both parties have done to help mold public opinion as they speak about public opinion. Before the election in 1972, a number of politicians in both parties were demanding a thorough investigation. But one of those who demeaned Watergate as a campaign issue, suggesting that it was unimportant and might be only a ploy by opponents of Nixon, was Barry Goldwater. Now, Goldwater, regardless of his ideology, whether one likes his politics or not, is regarded by many people as an honest man. So in April 1973, when Goldwater said that Nixon must speak out on Watergate, it wasn't just a plea from any old politician. It was a plea from a man of recognized integrity who had reappraised the significance of Watergate. Now, as it happens, Goldwater's son, Barry Goldwater, Jr., is a close friend of John Wesley Dean III and was also a college roommate of Dean's. And people who knew that may have read a deeper significance into Goldwater's remarks in April. Then in July 1973, Goldwater spoke out with even more bitterness. He made remarks to the effect that the President would have to prove his innocence in Watergate. But by August, Goldwater was saying something quite different. Still bitter about the deep-seated dishonesty and corruption exposed by Watergate, he charged that the liberal element was using Watergate for partisan purposes. Following the lead of Nixon, Goldwater said it was time to move on to other business. While several maverick Republicans, such as Lowell Weicker and McCloskey of California, could be expected to disagree, Goldwater seemed to be expressing the general viewpoint of his party, which, after all, was not entirely unpredictable. What about the Democrats? In theory, American politics is a rugged, continuing contest between Democrats and Republicans, with one party dominant in state, local, or federal positions. The other, anxious for its candidates to win in the next election, is supposed to serve as conscience, watchdog, and voice of the minority. Through ordinary legislative process and by alerting the public to the mistakes, foibles, or selfishness of elected officials, the two-party system theoretically keeps the party in power from becoming too powerful. I mentioned that in the summer of 1972, Wright-Patman tried to conduct a Watergate inquiry. It's my guess that Patman saw pursuit of the Watergate as something that would not only expose possible improprieties, but might help the Democrats as well. That's what two-party politics is supposed to be. Then, during the fall and winter, Senator Kennedy conducted his inquiry. That also was legitimate watchdog politics. But what happened in 1973, when the question no longer was what was Watergate all about, but rather was Watergate just politics? There was one very startling event. In May, the Democratic Party was on the verge of settling its Watergate civil suit out of court. Now, this suit, filed by Lawrence O'Brien in June 1972, had been a constant thorn in the side of the administration through the taking of depositions from men like Maurice Stans, Clark McGregor, Charles Colson, John Mitchell, James McCord, and others. Some very revealing facts were made public. Mitchell, for example, said under oath that he had met McCord only once. But in March 1973, McCord told the Ervin Committee that he used to see Mitchell almost every day. One of them had lied under oath. Clark McGregor, in a deposition July 20th, 1973, described how he never conducted any Watergate investigation when he succeeded Mitchell as the Nixon campaign manager in July 1972. But only a month later, the president said he had asked McGregor to conduct an investigation when he took over. An obvious conflict between McGregor and President Nixon. Through these depositions, re-election committee officials and others were caught in a number of similar contradictions, some of them important ones. Yet the Democratic National Committee, after secret negotiations with John Mitchell, was on the verge of settling this suit out of court, which would have prevented any further such disclosures. The settlement was averted apparently only by the outburst that accompanied newspaper reports that an end of the suit was imminent. A settlement of that suit, no matter how reasonably it could be explained, would be interpreted by many, without fail, as a statement that to the Democratic Party, Watergate politics was acceptable. More recently, and this is obviously subject to change, the Democrats have been strangely silent. What we seem to hear are the statements of leaders like Senator Mansfield, who want the Ervin Committee hearings ended promptly. From others, we hear just about nothing. To end the hearings promptly, to take them off television, to be silent, to let Watergate be handled as a legal matter, these are ways of molding public opinion, of telling citizens that Watergate politics is acceptable. After 2 weeks of televised hearings this past summer, the National Public Affairs Center for Television reported receiving 66,000 letters and telegrams from viewers, 99% of them commending the network for its primetime unabridged format, the showing of the committee hearings complete every night. There has never been any political event of such an attraction in the television era. One would think that in the two-party system, it would be the job of the Democrats to be explaining and interpreting the significance of Watergate every day. They have not been. It is therefore not unfair to question whether their silence means they feel that Watergate politics is acceptable. So this is what a citizen sees when he looks with genuine consternation to the nation's political leadership for help in trying to decide whether or not Watergate is just politics. He sees some men coming to the aid of the president, and he sees others who are silent. That is one way to mold public opinion. I've tried to cover a little bit of ground for you. I'll be glad to take on as many questions as I can, but please, I'd rather not get into matters of a clear opinion, such as should the president relinquish the tapes, or will Ehrlichman be convicted, or things of that kind. You know as much as I do about that. Thank you. You want to do that, or want me to do that? If anybody has a question, could he please step up to the microphone? I think that's the way we want to do it. No questions?
There'll be questions. Maybe they're afraid of the microphone.
Could you tell us who were the 6 Democrats who voted,
Well, let's see if I remember them all. There were.
and where were they from?
It's a very good story. There was Chappell, Stevens of Georgia, Brasco of New York. Those are 3. I believe 2 other Southerners and 1 from California. Now, of those 6 Democrats, let's see what I can remember about them. Stevens of Georgia, of Athens, Georgia, had introduced legislation for 3 years to help small-sized communities like his get more government financing for sewers. And each year, the legislation passed but was vetoed by the president. In the following 6 months after Watergate, Stevens got the sewers for his district, and more than that. Brasco of Brooklyn, 2 years earlier, maybe 3 years earlier, was threatened with an indictment. The prosecutors in Maryland said that he had done favors for a mafia group in the Bronx, New York, but John Mitchell refused to allow Brasco to be indicted. Mitchell had done that on a number of occasions, did that with Senator Long. Brasco said that what he was doing, he agreed that he had done this favor for a group that was connected with the mafia. He said he wasn't aware that it was mafia connected, but that it was for a constituent. Well, it wasn't for a constituent. The firm that he worked with was a Bronx firm, and it's an entirely different constituency. Of the other senators, Chappell, I believe, a week before his vote, went to the White House to have his picture taken with Nixon to send back down to his district. Nixon was much more popular than McGovern in many of those places. The Patman Committee, the thwarting of the Patman Committee hearing is a very strong story, and there's a brilliant article been written about it that may be in a magazine you have here on this campus. It's by a woman named Marjorie Boyd in the April issue of Washington Monthly. I would imagine you'd have a copy of that someplace on campus. It goes into a lot more detail about Justice Department work in thwarting that hearing as well. Yes?
You stated that you thought the reason because the Democrats were being, as you called, strangely silent, that it might be forming public opinion to the point that Watergate is just politics, but couldn't it also be that if the Democrats spoke out too much, that people would assume that they're just using it as a political maneuver instead of trying to bring about justice, as it seems that the Irving Committee is trying to do?
Well, that's a good question, and I'm sure that it's a question a lot of people, you represent the feelings of many. De Tocqueville said in 1835 in his book that great parties convulse nations and societies, and that minor parties only agitate. The catalog of Watergate horrors is extensive. Now, when people make up their minds on public issues, when public opinion is formed, people go through steps that are similar to steps you take when you read. They're so natural to you that you're not even aware that you're going through these steps. The first thing you do is see if you can draw your own conclusions. And you can draw conclusions about Watergate. You can come to a conclusion that the Ellsberg break-in was bad, that the bugging itself was bad, that the enemies list was bad, and you realize that everything is bad. But then along comes somebody saying, well, all of these things are common, almost, in politics. And the question has changed. We're asking a different Watergate question than we asked originally. What we are being asked now is, how serious a problem is it? Now, the failure of a party to get up and say it's terribly serious, it's in the way that I think I would like to explain it, is not simply letting justice being done. Granted, this is a point of view, but it's something that's saying to future Americans and to future presidents that no action will necessarily be taken against you for this kind of behavior. So what you expressed is a legitimate point of view, something we'll hear much of, but something that I personally would contend with. The first question, as I gather it, is, was it proper for the press to try to obtain secret grand jury proceedings? First, not all grand jury proceedings are secret. A witness to a grand jury, not a defendant, not a grand juror, not a prosecutor, but a witness, is perfectly privileged to say anything he wants to anybody about what he said before the grand jury. Whatever information we came up with that way. It's a common misapprehension about the secrecy of the proceeding. It's not entirely secret. Was it fair for the press to try to obtain these things? For a long period of time, it was clear that justice was being thwarted. With the nature of the open and shut case that the Justice Department had against Gordon Liddy, Howard Hunt, and those other men, and the narrow prosecution that it chose to follow, prosecuting them only for the bugging and for the break-in, they could probably have handed back indictments a month before they did and had a trial before the election. So at that point, in trying to get a hold of secret information, I believe the press was acting properly. I think there is a problem at this moment. I have faith, a very strong faith, in Archibald Cox. I think there's no way to stop Archibald Cox unless he's fired. And I don't know that anybody's going to fire Archibald Cox. I think this investigation will be very, very thorough. But what we're faced with is almost a decade of trials. Most of the indictments haven't come yet. We'll have trials all next year. We'll have retrials, appeals, things going up to the Supreme Court. The number of indictments in this case will make Teapot Dome look like nothing. Yet in Teapot Dome, the last trial, as I think I'm right, was in 1929, 7 years after the incident. So the question, will justice be served through the courts? Yes, I think justice will be served through the courts. But at the same time, I think that this is a political problem. It's a political issue, and politics is the people's business. Yes?
Is your newspaper going to investigate the possibility that the White House was involved in the coup in Chile?
We had an article on that in yesterday's paper, I believe. At least, I don't know how we're going to investigate something like that. What the article said is that there are all kinds of pressures that a government can apply, and this government applied financial pressures on the Allende regime. It didn't get IMF loans and other kinds of loans. Allende complained about it bitterly, and some people say that the Chilean economy was hurt so badly by pressure applied from the United States that you could say that the United States was involved in that manner. You're probably thinking of something more cloak and dagger-ish. We investigate what we can. I don't know that we're going to, it's certainly not something we would turn away from. Okay. Yes.
Both Benjamin Bradley and Catherine Graham have appeared at least on local Washington television, perhaps national television, saying that they thought that more than 2 reporters really should have been assigned to the Watergate case initially.
I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
I'm sorry. Both Benjamin Bradley and Catherine Graham have appeared at least on local Washington television and perhaps national television, saying that they felt that more than 2 reporters should have been assigned to the Watergate case initially by the Post. And you go on to say that you were obsessed by the Watergate case to begin with from its very outset. You learned about the connection between Hunt and Liddy and the 5 arrested individuals.
That's right.
Early in the case, you learned about the Dahlberg checks on July 31st. You know, you've got a report from the FBI as of, October 1st, saying that there was some substantial involvement between not only the people arrested, but also the Republican Party. Why was it, in fact, that only 2 reporters from the Post were assigned? How many people were covering, let's say, the Blue Plains sewage treatment plant in relation to the Watergate case?
Oh, our Blue Plains coverage was even worse than our Watergate coverage.
Only
Now,
one?
We have, it's a good question.
Why weren't more assigned initially if you were so obsessed?
First, the 2 reporters who were assigned to the investigative nature of the story. They were investigating Watergate. We had other reporters off and on. The first day, for example, a total of 10 reporters worked on aspects of the story. When Watergate was in court, our court reporter wrote about Watergate during this period. When Senator McGovern spoke about Watergate, a reporter traveling with McGovern was there. But so far as the investigation goes, it wasn't until October when we were told that Watergate was one maneuver among many that we assigned more reporters to it. Now, even then, we had more reporters than other people did on the story. Most places had hardly any reporters, maybe none. What I'd like to say in answer to that question is that the investigation was successful. When you do journalism by committee, you run into lots of problems. This was a very tightly knit group. They worked 7 days a week, and they worked 7 nights a week, just about from the beginning. I think they accomplished more as a unit than they would have had we had 4 or 5, maybe even 7 reporters working in an ordinary manner. When it came time, when it was clear that this was going to blow up, that it had blown up, we added, as other people did. I think your question is a very good one. In retrospect, we should have had more people on it, and still we were ahead of most other people in journalism. Yes?
Do you foresee the possibility of Mr. Woodward, Mr. Bernstein, or yourself being called to testify in future court cases, leading to the possibility that you may be charged with contempt of court if you reveal your sources?
There has been a request, and the newspaper has turned down the request. I don't know whether they'll be asked in the future or not. Our newspaper does not cooperate with a simple request for reporters to appear. I can't predict what the government will do. I would say that it seemed to me outrageous for the government to demand the appearance of these reporters in this particular story because they know pretty well where to look for the information they need. They don't need these 2 reporters at this stage to find out what happened.
Fear of anti-war demonstrations has been cited as one of the motivations for Watergate and Watergate-related activities. And I just wondered what part you thought that was a genuine explanation for what they did in Watergate, if that at all was one of their motivations for doing Watergate-type activities, and what you think the other motivations for doing those type of activities were.
Well, as I tried to say by grouping a number of things in Watergate, I think the fundamental crime was an assault on people's minds. Now, people involved in the Watergate incident itself, like Bernard Barker and and some Cubans up from Miami, were called to Washington at the time of J. Edgar Hoover's funeral, as you probably recall, to try to start a fight with people who would be expected to demonstrate against J. Edgar Hoover. They did that. In that regard, the anti-war movement was used as a foil, as the notion of Ellsberg. Ellsberg was a symbol to the Nixon government. And what the government tried to do was to link any dissenters, no matter how establishment they are, such as the New York Times and some politicians, with the anti-war, with the violent elements of the anti-war movement. But so far as the break-in itself goes, it's hardly explainable. Everybody seems to feel they were after information about Lawrence O'Brien that could be used against O'Brien. But O'Brien wasn't running for anything, and it's unclear what they would have done with that information. Is that an adequate answer?
Then you don't think they actually did fear very much anti-war demonstrations in '72, in the election year? Or
Yeah, but that's not an
That's kind of
explanation
a-
for Watergate, is it?
Yeah. Well, that's what some of them have tried to decide, and I just wondered if that was what you considered a genuine motivation, or just kind of a cover-up motivation for actual other
Well,
actual
the government has
motivations.
they've given examples of inviting anti-war demonstrations. At the Statue of Liberty in 1972, the Vietnam Veterans Against the War in New York City received in the mail 50 invitations to attend a speech by the president. When they came there dressed neatly, because they thought they should, the president singled them out as they held a few signs. It gave every appearance of being staged. We're familiar with the incident in Charlotte, North Carolina, where the Secret Service and some local people manipulated or worked the demonstration. Haldeman, you'll recall, was happy at obscene signs that were going to be brought there. I don't know that they were afraid of the demonstrations. It seems that they saw a use for the demonstrations in polarizing the country to a degree. Yes.
I have a question
see you
about I have a question about your reporter's technique. How were they able to go into private bank accounts and get the records to trace these checks, that were laundered through Mexico and were unreported?
The question is, how did our reporters acquire information such as bank records? Those